The Porsche 944 is well out of its awkward banger phase these days. Now it's a properly respected, cool classic car. But don't be blinded by these looks, there are still plenty of things you need to look out for. In fact, here's everything that you need to know if you want to buy yourself a Porsche 944. But first, our friends at Lancaster Insurance are giving you the chance to win this Sealy 12-volt cordless power tool kit, including hammer drill, ratchet wrench, impact driver, and more. Click the link in the description to enter, and good luck! The 944 was galvanised from the factory, but unfortunately that doesn't mean that they don't rust. Stone chips and damage over the years will see moisture get under the paint and slowly cause the brown stuff. It's particularly bad on the sills, where the factory body kits can trap moisture in and rot the sides of the car out. Have a good feeling here, get your hand all the way along, get under the car if you can on a jack or on a lift, shine a torch all the way under there, make sure those sills are solid. If your sills are rotten, numerous aftermarket companies can sell you repair panels, but OEM Porsche sills are also available, and they're a surprisingly reasonable £135. It's great if you can get underneath one of these cars when you're going to look at it, because there are lots of places underneath where they rot that you can't really see just on level ground. Check all the way around the floor pans, all the little crevices, make sure the hole underneath of the car is solid. And check the suspension mounts as well, because if they're rotten, that is difficult, complex, and if you're farming it out, quite costly bodywork to have done. The factory panel gaps on a 944 are surprisingly large at around 7mm, but they should be even all the way along. Have a good feel with your finger down all the join gaps for the doors, the wings and all the panels, and make sure they're level and smooth. If they're not, ask the seller about any bodywork that's been done to the car, intentionally or not. If there's more wind noise at speed than you'd expect of a Porsche, then it's likely down to a badly fitted or adjusted rear hatch. Again, have a look at the panel gaps all the way round, and if it looks like it's a long way out, it could just be a case of adjusting the hinges and pulling it in a bit. If there's any evidence of water ingress into the boot, there's damp carpets and that unpleasant musty damp smell, it could be down to blocked spoiler water drains, failed seals, or both. Also on the rear arches are these stickers that protect from stone chips and hopefully keep rust and paint damage to a minimum. Now if they are cracked and faded, which does happen with older examples, and you can buy replacement ones, but they're surprisingly expensive. Budget on around 70 quid for a full set of replacement wheel arch stickers. If the 944 you're looking at has got a sunroof on it and it's dripping water into the interior, it's a sign of blocked drainage channels. So open the sunroof and get a bit of wire or an air line down the drainage tubes, then pour some water down there and make sure that they're clear. The switches that electrically operate them can fail with age, that's not uncommon, but the switches are easy to buy and cheap. Finally, the plastic hinges on sunroofs can crack as they get brittle with age, but once again, because it's so common on these cars, replacement parts are easy and cheap to find and not too fiddly to fit. The 2.5 litre and 3 litre in S2's engine that Porsche developed for the 944 is fantastic. All aluminium, really reliable and good for big miles, well over 200,000 if it's properly maintained. And that means good quality oil, Porsche quality oil filters, and just general good maintenance. A good indicator of engine health is the oil pressure gauge on the dashboard. It should be 4 bar or more at speeds and between 2 and 3 bar at a hot idle. Any less than that and there could well be some internal problems. The 944 has an interference engine, and that means that if the cam belt breaks, the valves and the pistons will collide. So you need to be hot on your cam belt intervals. Cam and balance belts every 4 years, and rollers, tensioners and a water pump every 8 years, as well as new front oil seals. A rattly valve train isn't uncommon when these engines are cold, but it shouldn't be noticeable when they're hot. If it is, it could indicate a damaged camshaft or severe valve train wear, so keep an ear out with the bonnet up. On 16 valve cars, the S and the S2, the intake and exhaust valve are joined with a chain and the tensioner is oil fed. Now the pads on those tensioners wear out over time, and that means that about every 45,000 miles you want to be changing it. The Bosch airflow meters can give trouble, and this can lead to hesitation under acceleration or a stumbly idle. Try cleaning it out first, and if that doesn't work, specialists do exist to rebuild them for you. Have a good look at the cooling system. These cars are low and that means the radiator might have suffered some damage over time, so have a good look, make sure it's not cracked, check it's not leaking anything. Ditto the coolant overflow bottle. Make sure it's at a good level and again that it's not leaking. Thankfully, if it is, second-hand replacement ones are cheap and easy to find. As with any car that's getting on a bit, you want to have a thorough look at the condition of the fuel system. If there's any doubt over a hose being solid or leaking, replace it. And with the introduction of E10 fuel in the UK, it's worth noting that you can only run a 944 on super unleaded or use E10 with a fuel additive. On pre-85 cars, they use metal fuel tanks that can rot out over time. Also, the fuel pumps can fail over time, causing it hard to start or just not starting at all, but they're not a difficult or expensive part to replace. The 944 famously uses a transaxle gearbox layout where the engine is at the front and the gearbox is actually integrated into the rear axle for better weight distribution. If you've got a sloppy feeling gear change, it's probably down to a worn shifter linkage, which is a cheap and easy part to replace, but just a little bit fiddly if you can't at least get the car up onto jacks. A vibration through the gear lever, meanwhile, is down to worn torque tube bearings. The solution for that is a reconditioned torque tube that any number of specialists can sort out for you at a relatively reasonable price. A failing clutch on a 944 though is bad, expensive news. Because of that transaxle layout, you don't just take the gearbox out to change the clutch, you take the whole transaxle setup out of the car. So if you need a new clutch on your car, budget well over £1,000 to do so. The automatic gearbox in a 944 meanwhile is a pretty stout, reliable unit, but a burning smell, particularly when it's warm, is an indication the internals are starting to fail, and replacement ones are very expensive and quite hard to track down second hand. Porsche tend to know what they're doing with suspension, so it's small wonder the 944 suspension is pretty stout. If your car's got optional Koni M030 dampers on it though, and they're worn out, they are not cheap to replace. The front ones are £360 each. Thankfully, Koni specialists exist that can rebuild them for you, but even if you haven't got Koni suspension equipped, you are not out of the woods for expense. If you've got a loose, vague feeling front end, you're going to probably need a whole new lower front arm. On pre-1986 cars, they're the same as a Scirocco or a Golf, and they're nice and cheap. But later cars use Porsche bespoke aluminium items, and they'll run you around 250 quid each. Another common issue for 944s is power steering leaks. If your car's got power steering and it is leaving a little puddle every time you park it up, check the whole system. It could be the rack itself, and unfortunately that is quite expensive and difficult to replace, or it could be as simple as a leaky hose or a loose clamp somewhere. As for the fluid itself, you should only use Dextron 2 fluid for the system. The brakes though are superb. They stop these cars really well with or without ABS, but if your car has got ABS on it, it should be smooth and unobtrusive, pretty much like driving a modern car. The discs and pads meanwhile are really dependable, and even the most aggressive of drivers should get well over 20,000 miles out of a set of discs and pads. Winner! Being an old German car, most problems you'll have with a 944 electrically are either down to bad earths, corroded terminals, or failing switches. If an aftermarket alarm's been fitted to your example, and being an 80s car it probably has, then you might have issues with starting or unlocking. Unless it's essential for your insurance policy, we'd advise having that alarm removed immediately. The battery warning light, meanwhile, is part of the alternator charging circuit, and that means if it's had an LED bulb retrofitted, it's not going to work properly, the car is not going to charge correctly, and that can lead to other problems with other electrical components. The DME twin relay for the fuel pump and the ECU is a known weakness, and over time it can be hard to start the car, and eventually it will just refuse to prime the fuel pump and start altogether. A modern solid state unit is available, and it's a recommended upgrade from all 944 owners. As with when you're buying any car, check that everything electrical works. On a 944 there's a lot to play with, from rear wipers to electric mirrors, radios, make sure it all works perfectly. 944s use a thermostatic heater valve located at the back of the engine bay. If the valve sticks, it will only open or close fully, meaning you either get maximum cabin heat or nothing at all. Thankfully though, replacements are cheap and easy to fit. As for the trim, It's pretty hard wearing, much like the rest of a 944. You can get cracked dashes. Now, brand new ones can be bought, but you're almost into four-figure territory to do so. And unsurprisingly, the driver's seat bolster is particularly prone to being worn out, but you can recolour it, you can have it retrimmed, and second-hand seats are surprisingly cheap and easy to find. If your car's got air conditioning and you're bothered about it working, make sure it works when you buy it, because parts for the air conditioning system in a 944 are very expensive when you can find them. One of the best things about the 944 stylistically is these. The pop-up headlights are a signature part of this car's look, and generally they are reliable. Make sure they go up and down together and smoothly, and if one of them isn't quite right, have a look at the relays on the motors themselves. Thankfully those second-hand motors are cheap and again quite easy to find, so keep working on them until your 944s go up and down and look every bit as cool as these do. Nine 944s survive well, and that means that at any given time there are plenty on the market for sale. Budget around £3 for a project car. Any less than that and you've really got a glorified parts car. Double that to around £6 though, which is what we paid for this one, and you've got a usable project you can start having fun with right away. It will be high mileage, it's probably going to be 8 valve, but £6 for a proper pucker Porsche sports car is not to be sniffed at. If you fancy a convertible, they are on the market, but they're an awful lot rarer. The roofs are harder to replace if you do need a new one, and you're going to want to budget 12 or 13 grand as a starting point for a 944 cab. As for the illustrious turbo model, you're going to want as much as 20 or 25,000 pounds for a good one. We generally budget more sensibly 8 or 9,000 pounds for a good example of an 8 or a 16 valve car with a manual gearbox. Don't buy a gold one, don't buy a modified one, and don't buy an automatic, because all of those things will be turn-offs for buyers if you're not looking to keep your car forever. And don't go thinking that every part on a 944 is unique to Porsche and expensive. In fact, we're going to leave a link in the description to a list of all the parts on a 944 that are shared with other cars and from other manufacturers. That means you can save a bit of money. These aren't expensive to run, they're not yet expensive to buy, and long term they might well be a shrewd investment. Poor man's Porsche? More like thinking man's Porsche.